there everyone, I hope this finds you well inshallah. In this presentation I am trying to help you throughout your exam revision for the second semester in literature. The first video here deals with colonial period in America, mainly Puritan writings that took place during the era, discussing at the same time the most predominant writers of the time. American literature started as exploration literature because it was only about the documenting and the writings of the explorers circumnavigating the sea back then. It was only reduced to travel writings, adventures, journals, letters, or historical logs. Exploring into the New World dates back to Queen Elizabeth I's grandfather, who tried to raise the other European nations into gaining new land in the area. Elizabeth I was also the first female queen to explore into America, challenging the Spanish and trying the first slave business during the time. As far as establishing colonies there, the first permanent colony was under James I's reign, who ruled England from 1603 to 1625. Of course, James I was Elizabeth I's godson and cousin. On the overall of things, American literature of exploration tried to depict America as a promising land full of riches and opportunities in order to persuade the people to immigrate there and establish, by doing so, a land, a nation, a permanent settlement. It might be confusing to really question the reason behind us discussing Puritanism in American history or American literature. Of course, during that time, many things took place, especially during the so-called Renaissance. In general, Puritanism was a religious sect that appeared in the 1500s in England and in some parts of Europe. It's a religious sect which called itself Puritans or Puritan because it aimed at purifying the church from the Catholic rituals and practices. Here, before I speak about other things or go further, I want to highlight or emphasize upon things which are important to understand how did the Puritan ideology exist in America. During both Queen Elizabeth I's reign and King James I's reign, England witnessed the Renaissance. The Renaissance, of course, was a movement or a philosophy that appeared during the 14th century in Italy and then flourished in the other parts of Europe. In England, it deemed to be an artistic, or most importantly, a literary one, because it was more famous and more created in the theatre. The Renaissance was not about art, paintings, political philosophy, economics, or theatre, but also it was religious. During that time, King Henry VIII, father to Elizabeth I, decided to change religion from Catholicism to Protestantism, hoping by doing so to divorce his Catholic wife who could not provide him with a son and remarry another woman. The Pope of Rome at that time, who was ruling the entire Christendom, refused to grant him the divorce. He decided thus to break from Rome and to establish his own Anglican Church in England, making himself the supreme head of it. Here, two main religions existed: Catholicism and Protestantism. After a period of time, a group of extremists started to appear, claiming that Protestants were really still practicing some of the old faith rituals in worships. So they decided to separate from Protestantism and establish their own faith, their own dogma, cleansing and purifying the church. The things were fueled during King James I's reign because he was married to a Catholic princess. The Puritans, in the religious field as well as the political field, considered that he will open amiable and good relationships with the Catholic neighboring countries, including France, Spain, and Denmark. Unfortunately for them, King James I did just so. And because they felt persecuted in their own land, they decided to flee England, seeking political and religious refuge in the Netherlands. This group of Puritans settled in Holland for 10 years, and then because they felt that their children were becoming more Dutch than English, they thought that it would be better for them to come back to England and negotiate with the king to grant them permission to go to the New World. In 1620, King James granted them permission to immigrate, considering them to be separatists and no longer belonging to the English Church or the English Crown. They traveled from England, Plymouth, in the famous ship known as the Mayflower, landing in Cape Cod, Virginia, after 3 months at sea. When they first landed into the New World, it was very difficult for them to establish a livelihood because they didn't know how to live properly, how to build houses, how to plant crops or corn, how to hunt or fish, and it was only due to the Indians or the native inhabitants that they succeeded in starting a life there. The first Thanksgiving taking place a year after that, in 1621, shows that Puritans and Indians celebrated the grace and bounties of God in 3 days festivity where they shared food and drink together. Puritans, of course, were very hard workers. They favored education. They started to build schools, colleges, and they gave great importance to the press. The first American university was a Puritan one, which is Harvard University, named after John Harvard, its founder, in 1636 or 38. As far as the literary writings of the era are concerned, literature of the time was not very significant or amusing because it only focused on the teachings and commandments of the Bible. During the time, most Puritans defined good writing as something that will show or help people to be more aware of the importance of their worships, their daily or weekly practices, church practices, and spirituality, preserving themselves and their souls from the dangers of life and the pleasures faced on the earth. The Puritans considered themselves to be self-made as well as self-educated. They gave a great importance to education because it was only through being educated that understanding God's commandments and orders was granted. According to them, establishing life or establishing new colonies meant that people were serving God's ultimate mission, or the individual's ultimate mission on earth. For most Puritans, the world was seen as an arena of battle between God and Satan, between good and evil, and the enemy will come disguised in many ways. It can be disguised as money and financial opportunities, as economic wealth, political power, educational power and glory, and even it can be disguised in physical appearances, being well satisfied and proud about beauty and earthly pleasures. For them, everything was seen as a symbol, a sign that needed to be well interpreted and understood. So, secular life, for example, was never separated from the religious one in terms of economics, politics, education, and even the everyday treatments and transactions and practices between each other. Because for them, understanding life will only be held or well grasped when obeying God's rules and experiencing or practicing the Bible as a manual to live by. But What has this to do with literary writings? In fact, the first literature that was recorded was not about amusing stories or some imaginative writings, because all that was forbidden during colonial America. The only thing they could write about was history accounts or some of the everyday ordinary events taking place there. Because they didn't have anything to focus on and to write about, they started documenting the way they were living and the way everyone was trying to express his love and worship towards God, his master. So they cited the Bible and interpreted it literally, and they were kind of trying to always find a type of resemblance between the individuals living in the New World and between the stories of the Bible. History for them was also symbolic because it represented a set of scenes, photos and pictures of things that took place in the ancient worlds, in the Bible, in life in general. It reminded them of their triumph over the crown in England, over the way they have challenged their inconveniences and their lack of supplies when first traveling into the New World in order to establish God's Holy Land on earth. There were many predominant colonial writers during the time, but during this year we are only dealing with some of them. For example, William Bradford was known to be the first governor of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and who was amongst the first separatists, pilgrims who immigrated from England in 1620 in the Mayflower. Bradford was known to be pious, self-educated, and wise, and he ruled Massachusetts for 30 years. It is said that he had good relationships with the Indians, and he recorded the first accounts of the everyday life in colonial America. His famous of Plymouth Plantation from 1651 is considered the first history book to record or account the Puritan beginnings in the New World. William Bradford gave such great importance to history because it was for him the only way to know or to record life and learn from the people who preceded us or came or will came after us. So for him, history was a set of scenes that will help people or its readers learn from the past and never underestimate the past experiences. If it weren't for him, we would never know the way the first Thanksgiving took place and the fact that the first Puritans had forged good relationships with the Indians. Another important colonial writer was Anne Bradstreet, who was the first published American female of her time. Bradstreet was amongst the second wave of immigrants traveling to the New World in 1630. In class, we have dealt slightly with one of her famous poems, namely To My Dear and Loving Husband.
To My Dear and Loving Husband by Anne Bradstreet. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live, in love let's so persever, that when we live no more, we may live ever.
The most domineering theme in this poem is a passionate love letter of a wife to her husband. During the times, it was very difficult to write about such themes, but Anne Bradstreet was clever enough to use her poetry as expressing religious dimensions. Of course, she used a very simple style of writing where she was simply telling her husband how appreciative she was for him to be living or loving her in the way he did. Anne Bradstreet was very sure of his love that she was challenging the other females and asking them to prove the amount of love that their husbands expressed for them. As a female, Anne Bradstreet considered herself to be very lucky that she could never ask for precious things apart from or except from her husband's love, and because that was very endearing to her, she thought that she would never be able to repay or reward him, and the only payment she could grant him is God's grace in the heavens. And Bradstreet emphasized upon the fact that her love for her husband would last forever, even after her death, because it's about emotions and spirituality. Love, or at least marital love, for Anne Bradstreet is and was sacred, nothing to do with earthly pleasures and worldly life. Of course, throughout her career as a poet, she discussed many themes, including the childbirth, hardships, and mothering. But she was really inspired from the Bible, and in this poem in particular, she really used religious themes to express her love, a love of an obedient female towards a man, love of a woman that loves her husband because God ordered her to obey him and love him. Edward Taylor was another famous colonial poet who is also a minister and a teacher. Edward Taylor was known with his natural poetry, using aspects from nature and from the everyday life to express his feelings. He was inspired by the British Renaissance metaphysical poets such as John Donne and George Herbert, and he focused mainly on imagination using different styles. He basically wrote poems or themes about love and spiritual meditations. Another most predominant writer was Jonathan Edwards, who was also a preacher and a minister. He was best known for his powerful sermons and frightening, rigid style in delivering them. His most well-known sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is still considered one of the world's fascinating pieces of writing from Puritan America.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. We find it easy to tread on and crush a worm that we see crawling on the earth. So 'tis easy for us to cut or singe a slender thread that anything hangs by. Thus easy is it for God when he pleases to cast his enemies down to hell. They are now the objects of that very same anger and wrath of God that is expressed in the torments of hell. And the reason why they don't go down to hell at each moment is not because God, in whose power they are, is not then very angry with them, as angry as he is with many of those miserable creatures that he is now tormenting in hell, and do there feel and bear the fierceness of his wrath. Yea, God is a great deal more angry with great numbers that are now on earth, yea, doubtless with many that are now in this congregation, that it may be are at ease and quiet, than he is with many of those that are now in the flames of hell.
In this long sermon, I have only chosen some short extract to comment on. In his famous preaching, Jonathan Edwards was trying to remind the Puritans of their duty towards God, trying in this regard to focus upon the fact that most Puritans, most colonial people of that time, have forgotten about God's commandments and the teachings of the Bible, and God is angry with them, and he was kind of warning them not to follow the path of the sinners that are now being tormented in hell. God should be angry at the people living on earth because of their misdeeds and because of them forgetting about their mission and duty towards their Lord. The title is significantly expressing that God is angry or was angry at that very moment, just once, because of the people disobeying him at that period. And he could be more angry and always angry once they have no chance to repent and choose the righteous path. It is like telling them that you should be more concerned about what is going on in your everyday life and the way you are treating each other and acting on behalf of God's book, trying to prove your piety where there is nothing to prove that. You should be more concerned with obeying God and living according to His holy book, His manual that He provided you. He is angry at you because you are misleading the path. He is angry at you, and you have to be aware of the fact that at some point or at another you might slip and die, and there will be no chance for you to repent. Jonathan Edwards, of course, has been always concerned with people being disoriented. He was always trying, through his rigid style, to remind the people of their God and of the Bible. Because of the constant similar way of preaching the people in colonial America, people started to be like indifferent about religion. Colonial writers were somehow ignorant of the English authors and the European authors of the era because they rejected anything in relation with entertainment. It was all about religion. Cutting themselves from the world and trying to only express their ideas and their deeper meanings about religion and God and the church in their plain style, simple way of writing, led colonial Puritans, the people living at that era, to start and seek social and cultural entertainment, because for them it was no longer the era of preaching. People needed to really create or found economic opportunities and seek livelihood. It was not about reading the Bible anymore or just going to church on Sundays. So the southern part of the New World of America started to explore a new type of literary writings that were mainly secular, reflecting what was really taking place during the time, social and economic prosperity and flourishment. The first existing colony of Massachusetts started to experience mutiny, and people started to leave in order to re-establish new, more moderate colonies elsewhere, because they sought more opportunities for them and for their families. So they started being more interested in culture, in society. They started reading books from other writers, other nations, and they started bringing history and fictional stories into their themes and their plays. The first existing theater in America took place in 1716. Many famous writers existed at the time, including William Byrd, John Winthrop, Robert Beverley, Olaida Equiano, known as Gustavus Vassa, and Jupiter Hammond, the first black writers in colonial America, creating what was known later as slave narratives, as well as the famous female black writer Phyllis Wheatley, who was also a published author and poet. From that time onwards, literature changed, and people commenced to think about their lives and about creating a nation. A national literature will rise and revolution will break. From the colonial times, where America was only famous for its 13 colonies, a new nation will develop, flourish, and blossom. We will see that in the coming video, inshallah. This is all for now. I hope you find this useful. If you have any questions, please ask me. Good luck with your exams and salam.